Lee Van Cleef names the 6 celeb deaths that affected him most. Lee Van Cleef was born Clarence Leroy Van Cleef Jr. on January 9, 1925 in Somerville, New Jersey. Came from modest beginnings that gave little hint of the iconic screen presence he would one day command. His early life was shaped by discipline and toughness. He served in the United States Navy during World War II, an experience that gave him a stoic toughness and emotional restraint that later translated powerfully to the screen. After the war, Van Cleef moved toward acting almost by chance. His unusual angular face, high cheekbones, hawk-like eyes, and a lean frame did not fit the traditional Hollywood leading man mold of the 1950s. Instead of limiting him, those features became his greatest asset. Hollywood quickly recognized that Van Cleef could embody menace, mystery, and moral ambiguity better than almost anyone else. His early film career saw him cast primarily as villains and hard-edged supporting characters, often dying memorably on screen, but leaving a strong impression long after his scenes ended. One of his earliest and most notable roles came in High Noon 1952, where he played one of the ruthless outlaws threatening Gary Cooper's marshal. Though his screen time was brief, Van Cleef's presence was electric, silent, watchful, and intimidating. This performance set the tone for much of his early career as he appeared in dozens of westerns and crime films throughout the 1950s, including Shane 1953 and The Big Combo 1955. In these films, he often played men on the darker edges of society. Gunmen, enforcers, and criminals, characters who spoke volumes with a glance or a slow, deliberate movement. Despite steady work, Van Cleef's career suffered a major setback in the late 1950s after a serious car accident left him with a permanently damaged knee. The injury limited his mobility and made Hollywood producers hesitant to cast him, particularly in physically demanding roles. For a time, it seemed as though his career might quietly fade away. Yet, this period of hardship only showed Van Cleef's toughness. He continued working when he could, appearing in television and lower-profile projects, patiently waiting for the opportunity that would redefine his legacy. That opportunity came in the mid-1960s, not in Hollywood, but in Italy. Director Sergio Leone recognized something extraordinary in Van Cleef and cast him in for a few dollars more. 1965 as Colonel Douglas Mortimer, a coldly elegant bounty hunter whose intelligence and emotional depth matched his lethal skill. This role transformed Van Cleef from a familiar face into an international star. As Mortimer, he was no longer merely a villain or side character. He was a commanding presence equal to Clint Eastwood, bringing sophistication, quiet sorrow, and moral complexity to the spaghetti western genre. Van Cleef followed this triumph with another iconic performance in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, 1966, portraying the merciless Angel Eyes. His interpretation of pure, methodical evil remains one of the most chilling villain performances in film history. Angel Eyes was not loud or flamboyant. Instead, Van Cleef played him as calm, calculating, and utterly remorseless, making his cruelty all the more disturbing. His steady gaze and measured delivery turned simple lines into threats, cementing his place as one of cinema's greatest antagonists. In the years that followed, Lee Van Cleef became a cornerstone of European westerns, often headlining films such as Day of Anger, 1967, The Big Gun Down, 1966, and Death Rides a Horse, 1967. These roles allowed him to explore more nuanced characters, men driven by revenge, honor, or a harsh personal code rather than simple villainy. As he aged, his authority on screen only grew. He projected wisdom, danger, and experience, embodying the mythic quality of the Western anti-hero. As the decades rolled on and Hollywood itself began to change, Lee Van Cleef continued to reinvent himself, refusing to fade quietly into the background. In 1980, he appeared alongside Patrick McGoohan in The Hard Way, a gritty, stylish crime thriller produced by John Berman that showed Van Cleef's lasting ability to project menace, authority, and moral ambiguity with the slightest glance. That same year, he introduced himself to a new generation of action fans by starring opposite Chuck Norris in the martial arts hit The Octagon. As the film's calculating and ruthless antagonist, Van Cleef proved that even in an era dominated by younger action stars, his steely presence and icy charisma remained unmatched. His career momentum continued into the early 1980s with a memorable supporting role in John Carpenter's now legendary cult classic, Escape from New York, 1981. Though not the central figure, Van Cleef's appearance added weight and credibility to the film's dystopian world, reminding audiences that he could elevate any project with his distinctive screen persona. Yet, as the years passed, Van Cleef gradually slipped from the Hollywood spotlight, not because his talent had diminished, but because the industry itself was moving in new directions. In 1984, he made a notable return to television, taking on the role of a wise and formidable ninja master in NBC's adventure series, The Master. The casting was inspired. Van Cleef's weathered face and commanding presence perfectly suited the role of a mentor steeped in discipline and mystery. Unfortunately, despite its potential, the series was cancelled after just 13 episodes, cutting short what could have been a late career comeback on the small screen. Undeterred, Van Cleef continued working steadily, lending his gravitas to a variety of international and action-oriented productions. He supported Lewis Collins in the military adventure codename Wild Geese 1984 and later appeared alongside David Carradine in Armed Response 1986. Once again proving his versatility and willingness to embrace new genres and collaborators. Even in his later years, Van Cleef never abandoned his craft. He simply chose his roles carefully, leaving behind a trail of unforgettable characters. By the end of his remarkable career, Lee Van Cleef had amassed an extraordinary body of work, an astonishing 90 feature film roles and 109 television appearances across a span of nearly 4 decades. From classic westerns to modern action films, from cult television to international cinema, his legacy remains that of a consummate professional and one of the most recognizable and respected character actors in film history. Lee Van Cleef's life off the screen was marked by the same mixture of toughness, tenderness, and quiet endurance that made him such a compelling presence in westerns and crime films. Long before his angular face and steely gaze became synonymous with cinematic menace, he was a devoted family man trying to build a life during uncertain times. In 1943, he married Patsy Ruth Cale and together they raised 3 children. Those years were filled with the ordinary struggles of marriage, parenthood, and making ends meet. Far removed from the stark landscapes and gunfights that would later define his career. After 15 years together, the marriage came to an end in 1958, marking a deeply personal turning point in his life. 2 years later, in 1960, Van Cleef found love again with Joan Marjorie Drain. Their relationship unfolded during a period when his career was evolving, bringing both opportunities and pressures. While the marriage lasted more than a decade, it ultimately ended in divorce in 1974, showing how difficult it could be to balance the demands of Hollywood with personal stability. Despite the disappointments, Van Cleef continued to press forward, shaped but not broken by the emotional costs of his journey. In 1976, he married Barbara Havlone, the woman who would remain by his side for the rest of his life. Their union brought him a sense of steadiness and companionship in his later years, offering comfort as he reflected on a career that had finally brought him widespread recognition and respect. Barbara was with him until his death in 1989, standing as a quiet testament to the lasting bond they shared. Lee Van Cleef spent much of his career playing men who appeared emotionally impenetrable. Silent gunslingers, ruthless villains, and hardened survivors of a brutal frontier. Yet behind the sharp cheekbones and steely gaze was a deeply observant, sensitive man who paid close attention to the people around him. In rare moments of reflection late in his life, Van Cleef spoke openly about the losses that shaped him, naming 6 celebrity deaths that struck him with unexpected force and left lasting emotional marks. Gary Cooper. Gary Cooper was one of the first men who made me believe you didn't have to shout to command a screen, Van Cleef once said. Cooper's death in 1961 deeply affected him, not just as a fan, but as an actor learning restraint in an industry that often rewarded excess. Van Cleef admired Cooper's quiet authority, his ability to convey moral weight with minimal dialogue. When Gary died, it felt like Hollywood lost its backbone, he reflected. He represented an older code, dignity, simplicity, and honor. I tried to carry a little of that with me in every role afterward. Robert Ryan. Robert Ryan's death in 1973 was especially painful for Van Cleef because it struck close to home. Bob understood darkness, he said, not the cartoon kind, the real kind that lives inside people. Ryan, like Van Cleef, often played conflicted or morally ambiguous characters. Van Cleef felt a kinship with him both professionally and personally. When he passed, I realized how few actors were left who weren't afraid to look uncomfortable on screen. Bob didn't chase likability. He chased truth. John Wayne. Though their styles were vastly different, John Wayne's death in 1979 marked the end of an era for Van Cleef. You didn't have to like Duke to feel his absence, he said. When John Wayne died, the Western truly changed forever. Van Cleef saw Wayne as a towering symbol of classic American cinema. He was bigger than the roles. After he was gone, the West felt emptier, less mythic, more reflective. It made me aware that we were all fading into history. Richard Boone. Richard Boone's passing in 1981 hit Van Cleef on a more personal level. Richard had fire, he recalled. He was intense, opinionated, and absolutely fearless. Boone's intelligence and seriousness about the craft deeply impressed him. He respected the audience. He believed acting mattered. Losing him felt like losing one of the last men who truly challenged the system instead of bending to it. Henry Fonda. Henry Fonda's death in 1982 stirred a profound sense of finality in Van Cleef. Henry represented decency, he said quietly. Even when he played villains, there was a conscience there. Van Cleef admired Fonda's longevity and moral clarity. When he died, I felt the curtain closing on the golden age. These weren't just actors. They were anchors. They held the industry steady. Sergio Leone. Perhaps the most emotionally complex loss was that of director Sergio Leone in 1989. Sergio didn't just give me roles, he gave me rebirth. Van Cleef said, Leone's casting of him in for a few dollars more resurrected a career that had stalled. When Sergio died, I felt like I lost the man who truly saw me. Leone's operatic vision and belief in Van Cleef changed his life. Without him, the world would never have known the version of me that mattered most. In reflecting on these losses, Lee Van Cleef revealed a side of himself rarely seen. A man shaped not only by success, but by absence. Each death took a piece of the world I knew, he admitted, and each one reminded me that we're only passing through, leaving behind shadows on a screen. Despite years of failing health that would have sidelined most men, Lee Van Cleef refused to surrender to time or illness. From the 1970s onward, he battled heart disease, a silent enemy that shadowed him through the later decades of his life. By the 1980s, the installation of a pacemaker was a stark reminder of how fragile his body had become. But it never diminished his iron resolve. Even as his health got worse, Van Cleef continued to work steadily, driven by the same discipline and grit that had defined both his screen persona and his real-life character. To the very end, he remained a working actor, proving that his commitment to cinema was stronger than pain, fear, or physical limitation. On December 16, 1989, that relentless determination finally met its limit. Van Cleef collapsed in his home in Oxnard, California, after suffering a fatal heart attack. Though heart failure was the immediate cause, throat cancer was also listed as a contributing factor, showing the extent of the physical battles he had quietly endured. His passing marked the end of a career that spanned decades and left an permanent mark on film history, particularly in the Western and action genres, where his piercing eyes, angular features, and steely presence made him unforgettable. In death, as in life, Lee Van Cleef's legacy was defined with unmistakable clarity. He was laid to rest at Forest Lawn Memorial Park Cemetery in the Hollywood Hills, a place reserved for screen legends whose work helped shape the mythology of American cinema. Etched into his grave marker are the words "Best of the Bad," a fitting epitaph that perfectly captures his lasting image. It is a tribute not only to his iconic portrayals of villains, anti-heroes, and morally complex figures, but also to the mastery with which he brought depth, intelligence, and charisma to characters who could have easily been one-dimensional. That inscription stands as a final salute to an actor who made audiences love to fear him and fear to forget him. Lee Van Cleef may have played the bad guy more often than not, but he did so with such authority and style that he became one of the most respected and celebrated figures in genre cinema. Even decades after his death, his presence still looms large, proving that legends do not fade, they endure.